Greetings, friends of liberty. My, when we look yet again at the commotion the French are making, one would have thought that all their Sauvignon Blanc and Merlot had gone sour in the cellar. Here we are in 1793, and we see Les Crapauds always going from one extreme to the other. First they entertain in Versailles and elsewhere a series of absolute monarchs, tyrants, through the centuries, but now they've decided they've had enough, and off with his head, and Marie Antoinette's besides. Surely the fraternité of that procedure will elude her brother, Emperor Joseph? Have they not read their Aristotle and learned of the golden mean? In London we learn it in the first form. The mean by which one avoids the violent extremes and passions of both sides, and by which we here in England have taken a gradual and incremental approach to social change. Witness our glorious revolution. Was a single man killed? But the Frenchies swing from Louis XVI on the one hand to decapitations, mass drownings, shootings, and stabbings on the other. Now France, with the size of the Netherlands, their revolutionary commotions and desire to make war on other nations might be manageable, but given that they are such a large assemblage of cheese-eaters, their present unruliness, I fear, will cost many lives to subdue. But I dare say in 10 years' time, we and our allies shall have the best of them, as we did after only 7 in the 7 Years' War. Yes, we shall manage to save Europe from the French, and the French from themselves. Now if we turn to the task of the saving of the nations in your own 21st century in England, no less, we find today a former prime minister who has set herself that task, with a plan for her own country and the West in general to be accomplished within 10 years' time. I speak of Liz Truss and her recently released book, 10 Years to Save the West. Truss, of course, was famously ousted from her premiership in October of 2022 by the reaction to her mini-budget, with its well-meaning attempt to restore fiscal sanity to Britain's finances. In this quasi-memoir of her time in office and career as a politician, she lays out her judgment of what ails Britain and her proposals for its revitalization. She begins her memoir by telling us of meeting the Queen, as all starting prime ministers do, and being appointed, and that the Queen's advice was that she pace herself. Of the Queen's death 2 days later, she says, "Leading the nation in mourning after the death of our beloved monarch of 70 years was not something I had ever expected to do. I just felt a profound sense of sadness." When describing attending the funeral of the Queen at Buckingham Palace, she introduces one of the themes that reverberate throughout the book. When Elizabeth II first took the throne, the United States had taken on the mantle of leading the West. As I looked around, seeing leaders like Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, and Emmanuel Macron, I asked myself, has the fact that the global left has been in charge emboldened our adversaries? Having set the stage, she then takes us back to her political beginnings. Why did she want to go into politics in the first place? Because I believe in the battle of ideas and in pursuing the policies that will make things better. The West has lost its way. We need to wake up and meet the challenges before us, or we will lose. If this is allowed to continue, the West will be defeated by China, and authoritarian regimes will defeat liberal democracies. She then takes us through her participation and lessons learned in government for over a decade prior to her premiership, serving in the cabinets of various prime ministers. A as Undersecretary of Education and Childcare in 2012 under David Cameron. She, visiting China, noticed how much further ahead, 3 to 5 years in some cases, their children were than British children. How regulations concerning childcare, such as the number of children that each member of a nursery staff was allowed to look after, made childcare much more expensive. She's saying, ironically, that even in nominally more socialist countries like France and Spain, the regulations were much looser, with half or even a third as many staff being needed. How difficult it is to get action from civil servants who were not impressed when I began telephoning them directly to ask why the deadline had not been met. How, because of these expectations, she received the nicknames Strutting Marinette or Little Miss Dynamite from the press. How the reaction to her proposed modest changes in childcare regulations was regarded by the far left as akin to her wanting to establish cut-price baby farming. How child-centered education is really a lot of bollocks, since it means that children should be left to somehow discover ideas for themselves instead of just being taught them. And how she believes the free school movement, built on lessons from the charter schools in the United States and instituting a full voucher system in the United Kingdom, would significantly improve K-12 education. B, as environmental minister, again under Cameron, she recalls how many useless and costly regulations, such as building bat bridges over roads that no bats ever used, how the cost for decarbonizing the electricity system could cost upwards of £3 trillion, how fracking would be great for making the UK both energy independent and productive, slashing prices on natural gas far below what it costs to import American natural gas, how charities like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature are highly adept at lobbying and channeling public sympathy toward their agendas, how she led the badger cull in Britain, necessary for reducing the rate of infection of bovine tuberculosis by badgers of beef and dairy cattle, and how she understood that genetically modified crops can be enormously productive and inexpensive. C, summing up more recent experiences before becoming Prime Minister. She gives us a rundown of her time during Brexit, at first being caught in the middle of the debate, partly because being politically loyal to Remainers George Osborne and David Cameron, partly because she noted strains of anti-growth and protectionism among Leavers, and partly because of the Leave pledge to increase public spending on the NHS, which seemed an odd rallying cry for free market conservatives. In the end, though, she believed in Brexit, noting, however, that, at present, the vast majority of EU law remains on the British statute book. It's a bit like getting divorced and then continuing to live in the same house as your ex-husband. She tells, as trade minister, how she was glad to see the back of the anti-British condescending Obama, whose failures in Syria and Russia would come back to haunt us, and who, in his stupid arrogance, threatened us going to the back of the queue for a trade deal. How, in her view, the British judiciary has become a self-appointed oligarchy, choosing and promoting those who shared their values, which resulted in a lack of meritocracy in the selection of judges. How these judges increasingly use the process of judicial review to get their way. How the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act imported from the EU were especially egregious and tied up the government in red tape and gave more powers to the courts and lawyers. And finally, as Secretary of Justice, how prison officers were some of the most impressive and least appreciated public servants came across and massively underpaid. D. Let's now turn to the events around her 49-day premiership, which began on September 6, 2022. Here she informs us in candid detail of, number one, the growing leftward shift in the Conservative Party. She noticing that MPs who used to talk about limited government and cutting regulation have increasingly been championing net zero, pushing for gender self-identification and opposing fracking, these shapeshifters are conservatives in name only, sinos. Number two, how those of us who believe in popular conservatism, or a modernized version of Thatcherism, believe in the nation state, low taxes, and individual responsibility. Three, how Rishi Sunak was fundamentally the candidate of the status quo, as he has unfortunately proven to be. Four, how, given all the difficulties that it posed for she and her family personally to live at 10 Downing Street, I'm not sure it would be rated well on Airbnb. These difficulties included clocks constantly chiming throughout the night, preventing sleep, protesters outside chanting during the day, upsetting concentration, the inability to easily get outside the ring of steel for exercise, fresh air, or relaxation. And she is the head of a G7 nation needing to make her own arrangements for her hair, appointments, and other personal activities. On the other hand, one of the positives at number 10 was Larry the cat. He is a lovely character and seems to take a liking and disliking to all the right people. Number 5. She comments on the constant leaks from a prime minister's cabinet nowadays, which makes even informal discussions more fraught and distrustful. Number 6, how as prime minister she didn't want to focus on and be distracted by day-to-day news events and the news cycle, but instead to focus on big issues. But when she told her staff of this desire, she found to her fury that even my instruction for trivial briefings to stop had itself been briefed to the press as a story. Number 7, she, or more accurately, her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, announced her economic growth plan, called the mini-budget, in the Commons. It entailed a reduction of tax rates from 45% to 37%, a decrease in planning and zoning regulations, and an energy package. Of course, she introduced this because UK economic growth has so stagnated that UK GDP per capita is now at the same level it was in 2007-8. And she introduced her radical mini-budget immediately because we urgently needed to change the trajectory if we were to have any chance of seeing results by the time of the next general election. Number 8. She notes ominously how powerful various UK governmental financial institutions are, such as the Treasury, which she compares an influence in the U.S. to having the White House Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Treasury, and the Congressional Budget Office all rolled into one and headed up by civil servants. The Treasury, she argues, is filled with left-of-center bureaucrats who by their nature oppose the very economic policies she was trying to implement. In addition, both the Bank of England and the Office of Budget Responsibility are not subject to challenge from elected politicians. And she adds significantly, as we shall see, they are more interested in balancing the books than growing the economy. Number 9. Her claim is that these varied officials in their respective institutions fundamentally misunderstood the effectiveness of her tax cuts, of supply-side economics. According to supply-siders like Arthur Laffer, in the long run, cuts are believed to increase tax revenue by stimulating business activity, investment, and the migration of businesses from other countries to yours. As she says, squeezing more money out of the economy in the short term with tax rises might seem a prudent way to reduce the budget deficit, but it risks killing the goose that lays the golden egg. She believes that the Treasury, because they don't understand this, made a £20 billion annual mistake in their forecasts here. And her claim is, because these bureaucrats misunderstood, they, whatever their intentions, acted to torpedo her mini-budget and thus ended her premiership. Number 10. Given her awareness of this bureaucratic resistance, she, along with some cabinet ministers such as Simon Clarke and Jacob Rees-Mogg, debated whether to go in very hard, abolish the Office of Budget Responsibility, and appoint senior leaders in the Bank of England and Treasury who were prepared to challenge the orthodoxy. That would have been extremely dramatic and amounted to a declaration of war on the economic establishment. Number 11. She admits to being relatively unaware, as most people are, of the role of liability-driven investments, or LDIs, which partially caused her downfall because once markets got the idea that her budget would require much more governmental borrowing on the part of the Bank of England, and thus that interest rates would rise, these liability-driven investments, being variable rate and having invested during periods of low interest rates formerly, would lose serious value when the interest rates rose. And the market took fright at this prospect, with the Bank of England needing to step in and blaming Liz for the problem of the potentially collapsing pension funds, which depend on these LDIs. Number 12. Her Chancellor, Kwesi, headed off to an IMF conference as things were coming to a head. And since the Bank of England now refused to buy any more bonds, which would have stabilized their price, she was forced, in order to calm the markets from a meltdown, to give up on her entire program. And since that meant that the whole purpose for which she had become Prime Minister was now unattainable, it was time for her to resign. Number 13. She concludes by saying, "What did I learn from my time at Downing Street? The main lesson I drew is about the sheer power of the administrative state and its influence on the markets and the wider polity. I had not understood until I became Prime Minister how powerful these people are." Let's now turn to evaluating the book. Number 1, I would give it a B. If Liz were appointed benevolent dictator of the UK for 5 years, would it be a significantly improved country afterwards? Yes. Number 2, regarding her mini-budget, I would make 2 points. A, present Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's budget and administration is actually adding more to the national debt than hers would have. But so far, no panic. B, on the other hand, her energy guarantee, her plan to subsidize the heating costs for households above £2,500 per year, could have added up to £100 billion annually to the budget, according to Kate Andrews at The Telegraph. This was regarded by markets as fiscally irresponsible and contributed to their anxiety. Number 3, this book functions as both a memoir and a set of implied or explicit suggestions for policies. But I would have found it more effective as an argument for saving the UK if she had A, explicitly grounded it all in individual liberty, discussing how unfree individual Britons now are, and B, then showed the results of more freedom on a wider range of issues, like the NHS, the drug war, crime rates, and the welfare state, which she hardly mentioned. In addition, A, she talked about wanting to repeal the Equality Act 2010, a broad anti-discrimination law which, as she says, tied up the government in red tape and gave more powers to the courts and lawyers. Tied up. Lawyers. Repealing this would be highly beneficial. Repealing this would be highly beneficial, since in both the UK and the US, with its equivalent Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act, these acts on both sides of the Atlantic help legally backstop the rise of woke ideology, which, as we know, pretends that the US and UK are racist, homophobic, and sexist. Not so anymore. But even if they were, the Equality Acts and Title 7 and 9 are not the way to reduce these prejudices. To the contrary, they increase prejudice overall, as we see every day, for example, in the Hamas demonstrations on US campuses and in London protests. B, she believes in liberty and even named her youngest daughter Liberty, but nowhere realizes the importance of privatizing higher education throughout the West. Shouldn't we liberate our colleges from state regulations and funding? Even more than the Equality Act 2010, public higher ed creates and nourishes the woke, PC, green, trans, anti-Semitic, and socialist ideologies now infecting our young people and society in general. Private higher ed would not. C, she says she's for free trade, despite believing in a complete ban of all trade with China. All trade. Now, she's right that IP violations by Chinese firms should be prosecuted, and products made by slave labor should be banned, but a complete ban, like President Trump's on steel, is highly counterproductive. Trump's ban resulted in a serious net loss for Americans because the increase in American steelmaking capacity under this protectionism was very small. But the reduction in products in all the businesses that use that cheap Chinese steel to make products was great. In addition, China was actually weakened by the enormous monies required for subsidizing the making of that cheap steel, which everyone around the world bought, weakening the Chinese economy. So buying subsidized Chinese steel was good for the West and bad for China. She doesn't get that. Very happy for my part that we here in late 18th century England have hardly any higher public education at all, which absence is likely partly responsible for the very emergence of Enlightenment thinking by many privately or self-schooled individuals. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.